Brazil is moving to become one of the first countries to regulate content on social media with the purpose of curbing misinformation. The Brazilian House has fast-tracked the so-called fake news bill, and this week we will discuss what is in the bill and why it is so important. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Brazil This Week. This week I'm joined by Cedê Silva, our Brasília correspondent. Cedê, glad to have you back with us.
Thank you, Gustavo. Good afternoon.
So Cedê, the Brazilian House on Tuesday voted to fast-track a bill that will regulate how misinformation will be dealt with. And this is a very consequential bill, but we still don't necessarily know the nuts and bolts of this text, right?
Precisely. So the legislation at the House and the House rules allow lawmakers, when they vote to fast-track a bill, they can vote on the original bill itself, but not the final text. The way that Brazilian legislative process works is that every bill has an original author, and they also have a different lawmaker, which is the rapporteur, which makes the final draft, the final text. The lawmakers, they could vote to fast-track the original bill, but they're not going to vote on that text. They're going to vote on a new report by Congressman Orlando Silva, and this text is not yet known. It was not published yet, was not made public. So the lawmakers are urgently moving on something that nobody knows exactly what it is because the final text is not yet made public.
And the problem with that is where House Speaker Arthur Lira, once the motion to fast-track the bill was approved, he said that the text, the core text, could be voted on by next Tuesday, May the 2nd. So it means even if the bill had been submitted like a second ago, that would still be very short time to analyze a project that will essentially change how the internet works, right? Because it will fundamentally alter the framework for how content is dealt with, how we're going to regulate platforms. What do we know in broad strokes? Because like you said, the fine print still hasn't been unveiled. What do we know so far about what we should or we could expect to see?
Well, we know a few things about the provisions that the new text will probably include because a motion to fast-track this bill was voted last year on April 2022, and the motion failed. And at that time, we knew what the final text at that time was. It included, for example, a provision that defines that lawmakers have on their own social media the same legal privileges they enjoy in Brazil for being members of parliament. And so they would enjoy full legal immunity and even protection from the social media on terms of use from any liability due to their being lawmakers. So lawmakers would have privileges and immunities that regular users of social media do not have. The second thing is that the original bill includes language that in the future, social media would pay money to newspapers and to media outlets for their content. And this is what basically the broad strokes that will probably remain in the new draft to be voted next week. The other major thing that is being discussed, and we do not know the final form yet, is that this bill will likely change current Brazilian legislation in what regards civil and criminal liability of social media for user-generated content. So currently, Brazil has legislation very similar to Section 420 in the U.S. Legal parameters, which is that application providers such as
Section 230, right?
Section 230, sorry, yes, you're correct. Section 230, which in Brazil and with similar in the United States and with similar legislation in Brazil, this provides immunity for the social media providers and for content providers such as blogging platforms against content produced by the users. So if you own a media company that offers a service for people to have a blog, the media company is not responsible for what the bloggers are posting on their blogs, or people that post comments on the newspaper website. The newspaper is not responsible for those comments and so on. This is very likely going to change, and this is why this new legislation has been opposed by the big techs. And Google's president in Brazil has already spoken that this new legislation should be draconian for the big techs.
And let's break down these provisions that you have laid down, Cedê, because, for instance, the immunity to members of parliament, this is very consequential because we recently saw electoral courts impeach a state lawmaker because he was in the 2020 election spreading misinformation about Brazil's electoral system. And so he lost his term. It was an unprecedented decision. And at that point, Brazil's chief electoral justice said that he thinks Brazil should regulate social media. And that connects with the last point you made about liability on content, that social media platforms should be treated as media organizations. He said that during the trial of that lawmaker. And this is interesting because the provision that you mentioned, which is equates to Section 230 in the US, is because social media acts as a public square. It should not be responsible for what one or another person says. If it were to moderate, if it were to exert some sort of curation, then like media organizations, like for instance, we at the Brazilian Report, we choose the op-eds we publish, we choose the articles we publish, so then we become liable for what we publish. But so these reactions will be game changers, right?
Yes. So for instance, in the United States, Section 230 is still valid, despite opposition to it or calls for reform from both sides of the aisle. This was in the 2020 election, one of the very, very few issues in which Donald Trump and Joe Biden agreed, and they both agreed in revoking Section 230 and increasing the liability for companies. The thing, however, that separates the right and the left wing in this case, and both in the United States and in Brazil, is because the right wing is opposed to any regulation of social media and or of the internet in general, because they want to retain a full, radical, complete freedom of speech for any content, including homophobic, transphobic, hate content whatsoever. And they want this freedom to be completely absolute. And so the government should not interfere in any way on how the social media operates. And the left wing, on the other hand, is concerned that the terms of use should limit hate speech and should limit disinformation about the electoral system or about vaccines or about health and so on. So this agreement that things cannot stand as they are comes actually from different motivations. And we are seeing this playing out in Brazil this week. The right-wing Movimento Brasil Livre and some far-right politicians, they spoke against the motion to fast-track the bill because they want to keep the internet with little regulation as possible. And we've seen people ally to the government in favor of the urgency, in favor of fast-tracking the bill, and in favor of social media regulation.
No, and one thing that is exasperating for me in this debate is because on one side, The right, like you said, he wants an absolute notion of freedom of speech, similar to the Bill of Rights that the U.S. Constitution has. But, and this is very important, Brazil does not have any provisions such as the First Amendment. In Brazil, freedom of speech is not an absolute concept, and you cannot say certain things like call someone a racial slur. This is a crime for which you will respond in jail without the right for bail. You cannot defend Nazism or anti-Semitism. So it is a very different framework for freedom of speech. Then on the left, what for me is quite frustrating is how little debate we're allowing this question to have in terms of civil society. This is the provisions are being unveiled in a drip fashion, very little transparency. And the problem is because of the January 8th riots and the recent attacks on schools, and because of how social media played a big role in those two things, we are seeing this sort of reaction to a traumatic event that sometimes is not the best way to regulate when you're just coming off a very traumatic event.
Before continuing the show, we'd like to introduce you to our latest release, our exclusive report on the first 100 days of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's third term as Brazilian president. Lula's 100 days, myriad challenges and unforced errors is a valuable strategic tool that brings you in-depth analysis from our experts on the most important issues from the beginning of Lula's administration. In this exclusive report, you'll find insights and analysis on the government's support base in Congress, Brazil's return to foreign policy, fiscal, economic and environmental challenges, as well as how the administration is tackling social media regulation and planning to fight hunger. Don't miss this opportunity. Enjoy your read.
I would just like to ask our viewers to go to our website and subscribe to our channel because it's the journalistic engine behind all of our content. You can go to Brazilian.report/subscribe, which you have just above Cedê's head, you have the URL, or just below Cedê's head, you have a QR code that if you have already subscribed to our content, you can still support our company by offering one of our journalists a cup of coffee. You go to buymeacoffee.com. You can either make a one-off donation or join one of our membership tiers and get exclusive content on Brazilian culture, on how we do our journalism, get the behind-the-scenes content on how we get the information we do. It is something that I believe it's very important because I think a lot of people do not necessarily believe in media organizations because they don't necessarily know how the work is being done, and we are in this exercise of transparency. So you can either flash the QR code that you have here, or go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report for more information. So Cedê, you have talked about this left-right opposition around the fake news bill, and where do other actors stand when we talk about, I would assume, and I think it's easy to assume that platforms are in favor of as little regulation as possible. How they are trying to weigh into this conversation?
Yeah, so since last year, when the other draft of the bill had a motion for fast-tracking placed to a vote and it failed, so since last year, Google and Facebook in Brazil, they have aired ads, they have placed ads in newspapers, and Google has even paid for ads on Instagram, which belongs to Meta, which is its competitor. And so these ads by Google and Meta are against the fake news bill and against a stricter regulation. These companies have argued that the rules are not sufficiently transparent, that it is not sufficiently well described how they are supposed to pay for the newspapers for their content and for in a sense, profiting from the content of these newspapers. And also because this regulation would limit freedom of speech and would pose, allegedly, troubles or hindrances to small businesses that pay for ads and use social media and use media platforms and internet platforms to advertise and to sell and etc. On the other hand, you've got a few Supreme Court justices which have spoken in favor very publicly about social media regulation. And this is something that US listeners will find strange, but in Brazil, it is very common for most Supreme Court justices to give interviews, to participate in lectures, and even to speak very publicly about legislation, which it is very weird, and it is not supposed to work like that. Even in Brazil, we've got one justice. She's named Rosa Weber. She does not give interviews. She's the only one who plays by the book, but all the others, they're very public, and some of them...
By the way, not only does she keep mum about the matters she's about to judge, she also respects precedent, which is should be the norm, but is actually the exception in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. And too bad she's retiring this year. And not only that, but some Supreme Court justices in Brazil even have Twitter profiles, and they will tweet about their favorite song and about what book they're reading, and they will try sometimes to send messages through these mysterious, elusive tweets. The Supreme Court held recently a 2-day public hearing about the regulation of social media and about court decisions that can influence social media regulation in Brazil, including striking down Brazil's equivalent to Section 230. And at this public hearing, we got to see a few law scholars and also some people from large media organizations speak. And this gave us an opportunity to know about the positions of different actors in this. So one of the people to speak at this public hearing was Marcelo Bechara, who is Director of Public Policy at TV Globo, which is Brazil's main broadcaster, a huge media giant and responsible for Brazil's main newscasts, Brazil's main soap operas, the telenovelas, and so on and so forth. So a huge media empire in Brazil, headquartered in Rio. And Marcelo Bechara spoke with an interesting metaphor about the regulation of social media in Brazil, which arises from regulatory trauma. So Gustavo used the word traumatic, which I think is very important to this issue because regulation mostly arises after trauma. So something traumatic happens, and then regulation arises to try to prevent it from happening again. Similar to what happened after 9/11 in the United States. The Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11. TSA was vastly increased its powers and in inspections in airports. And so these new rules, they arise after a traumatic event. So in Brazil, in the early 2000s, we had the Daniela Sicarelli event. So for people from outside Brazil, Daniela Sicarelli was a famous VJ in MTV Brazil, a famous model. She was at the cover of several magazines. And in the 2000s, she was filmed by a paparazzi in a beach in Spain, making out with her then boyfriend. And this video was leaked to YouTube, which was very new at the time. This was 2007, 2008, something like that. YouTube was an emerging platform, and videos on the internet were a starting thing. There was an emerging thing because it was hard, because of broadband limits, to consume video on the internet. And a judge ruled that because the videos of her making out with her then boyfriend on the beach were spread out over YouTube and YouTube could not contain these videos, the judge ruled for YouTube to be struck down and shut down completely in Brazil for all users. So that's the whole of YouTube, all the videos, until the case could be solved. And so when Brazil enacted the Internet Civil Rights Framework a few years later in 2014, when Dilma was president, the Civil Rights Framework has an exception for exclusively content that involves nudity and sexual activity. So the rule now in Brazil is that social media providers, social media companies, they do not have an obligation to strike down any sort of content before a judicial measure, before a lawsuit and a judge tells them to do so, except if it's content with sex or nudity. Then, if it's unauthorized content with sex and nudity, the social media companies, they are legally obligated to take them down before a judicial decision. Marcelo Bechara, the TV Globo's public policy director, argue that this creates an imbalance between content that involves unauthorized sex and nudity and other kinds of speech, such as hate speech, racist speech, transphobic speech, and etc. If you were caught or a video with nude photos or nude images of you leaks to the internet, then that is protected, and the social media companies need to strike it down immediately. But if you are the victim of bigotry or racism or homophobia or other social content, then the social media companies, they can rest quietly and wait for a judicial decision and wait for a judge to order them to take down this content, by which time content spreads like wildfire on the internet, and it might have been seen or watched by hundreds or thousands or millions of people.
No, and the problem is, and this is a very thorny issue, because on one hand, the platforms, they have done very little, next to nothing, to curb this sort of hate speech or misinformation content, because it engages a lot. It is the sort of content that makes people either enrage or people like it, but they react to it and they remain in the platform and they make they engage with the platform. And in terms of when we talk about this attention economy, that is currency. The more time you spend on an app, on a platform, the more value you're generating for them. On the other side, and this is interesting because a few months ago, the NGO Freedom House named Brazil as one of the quote unquote swing states on which internet freedoms depend because of these swing states' regional or global influence on the future of internet governance. So, I mean, what we are discussing right now is not a Brazil problem, but it's actually a global issue that may have repercussions in other countries and may set a dangerous precedent, depending on whether we go too lightly or too heavily in terms of the regulations, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things you mentioned, that they have the social media companies have little incentive to ban or to moderate this kind of content, and that is true. And the other kind of content is about fraudulent content involving lots of money. So at the Brazilian Report, we have recently talked about this decision by the Ministry of Justice to investigate, to have its consumer department investigate Google, because Google owns YouTube, and there are lots of scams videos on YouTube. For example, promising an inexistent scheme for people that own credit cards to be refunded some inexistent tariff that the government inadvertently charged them. And so some of these videos, and I've watched them, they have hundreds of thousands of views. And you've got several videos like this. So you've got millions of views of these videos with fraudulent scams, fraudulent schemes for people to get credit card money that does not exist. And the way that the legislation works is Google and other social media companies, they do not have any obligation to take these videos down unless there's a court order first. But they are profiting right now with the ads from the millions of views of these contents. So they do not have the legal liability, but they can get the money from the ads and from the audience. And one of these scammers, and I watched the video, when you are a YouTuber, if you have over 100,000 subscribers, you get a plaque from YouTube. And he owns one of these because he has over 100,000 subscribers, and he records the videos with one of these placards backing his wall. So YouTube is endorsing through this placard this kind of content, but they do not want to be held legally liable. Of course, on the other side, there's also a competing commercial interest by TV Globo and other traditional legacy outlets, because TV Globo, for instance, has recently entered the segmented digital ads market because TV Globo owns its own streaming service, Globo Play, and small businesses who cannot afford paying for ads on network TV, which is very expensive, they can air ads still in global products through the streaming service. So, of course, there's also commercial competition between legacy media and the big techs.
Yeah, no, and this is there are no innocent parties, right? But today, moving on, just before we close this conversation, I would like to ask you, because this vote on the fake news bill, it was also important because it was the first important vote since the beginning of the legislative year. And I mean, we're almost in May. This is crazy. This is, I mean, as far as I can remember, there hasn't been a slower start to the legislative year. So Lula was elected in this huge tent coalition, but nobody knew for sure how strong his coalition actually was or is. And what were the signs that the fake news bill vote gave us, like this first test? I mean, we can't say that the government passed the test because the government was backing the motion to fast track the fake news bill, and it passed. But I mean, did it pass with flying colors or was like barely meeting the threshold?
Yeah, they barely met the threshold. It was a very tight vote. The motion to fast track the bill this time actually got less votes than it did last year, when it was, of course, things were inverted and the fake news bill was mostly sponsored by the then opposition to the Bolsonaro administration. And they had less vote this time. And also an important sign of this voting was that lawmakers affiliated with União Brasil, which is one of Brazil's largest parties and has 3 cabinet ministers in the Lula government, did not deliver votes. In fact, more União Brasil lawmakers voted against the motion to fast track the bill than they voted in favor. And somewhat weirdly, the Republican Party, which in Brazil, the Republicans are mostly associated with evangelicals and mostly associated with the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, they actually delivered a larger chunk of the votes in favor of the motion, and they were a closer ally than União Brasil is, despite there being no Republicanos ministers in Lula's cabinet. And you have got 3 ministers of União Brasil in Lula's cabinet. So this was an early warning sign that the Lula administration is perhaps not getting the tit for tat it would desire by having these ministers in the cabinet and having their lawmakers of the same party not corresponding to the support that they wanted and getting their support rather from somewhere else, getting from the evangelical party, most of which evangelicals, a large majority of evangelicals, voted for Bolsonaro last year. So this might hint to Lula or to his administration that when it comes the time for a cabinet reshuffle, that União Brasil is not delivering what they want.
And by the way, not only the support is not there, but the scandals that have hit the cabinet have consistently hit União Brasil ministers, right? So, I mean, you also have that. But and we're going to see how this evolves because the government has some thorny and highly consequential votes ahead in regards to the fiscal framework that the finance ministry has proposed, or a reform of the tax code, which is something that the government is defending and which has always been extremely hard to get past Congress. Cedê, thank you very much. Before I let you go, I would just like to once again ask our viewers to subscribe to the Brazilian Report because our business model is based on subscriptions. So go to Brazilian.report/subscribe and get one of the membership tiers. We have 3 of them. One of them is necessarily going to meet your budget and your needs. Or you can go to Brazilian.report. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Brasilia Report and buy a cup of coffee to one of our journalists, or make a monthly pledge to buy us cups of coffee and help us deliver the most important issues on Brazil and Latin America every single day. Cedê, thank you very much for your insights, and I hope we're going to talk soon about these developments. Have a good one, man.
Thank you, Gustavo. See you next time.
And thank you for joining our conversation. Brazil This Week will be back next Thursday. Ciao.